Okay, so we get to number 4. The role of analogy is to aid understanding rather than to provide justification. To what extent do you agree with this statement? Great title for people who are coming at it from an arts viewpoint, also from a sciences viewpoint. And definitely my favorite title. This is the one that I would choose if I was writing this essay. Initially, we're going to be defining terms as normal, and key term here really is analogy. So you could be defined in terms of the way that the interplay happens between imagination, language, and inductive reasoning. It operates using shared characteristics, but how are these defined? Are they defined by physical properties in the sciences or by symbolic properties in the arts? Creativity and imagination, there's lots of references in search of creative thinking strategies that you could look for. So that was just a real quick Google search, and lots of stuff came up right away. Definitely, I would be having a look at a couple of these and looking around a bit more, because analogy is something that has been well studied in logic. Aid understanding, the notion of aiding our understanding. Well, you have to think about when do we want understanding? Why do we want this? And also, what does it mean to understand something? You could use some basic examples like the plum pudding model of the atom or the clockwork universe, the mechanical universe from physics. But I don't think you would want to harp on those examples for any extended period of time. You could have a little bit of it as an intro to the type of example, and then you would need to get much more interesting examples, more recent examples. If you were looking at physics, then you could be looking at the cosmos, quantum mechanics, and augmented reality. In biology, you can be looking at recent understandings of human consciousness, the human brain, and how that works. There's also a lot of new stuff with VR, AR, and mixed reality. Is there anything happening in the sciences there that ordinary people, there's no way we can understand it, but what analogies do those technology developers, those experts, those scientists, what do they use in order to convey the workings and the understandings that they have to us, to ordinary lay persons? And maybe that's an interesting line too. When is analogy most used? We'll get to that in a second. Analogy doesn't have to be a direct comparison, but it could be implicit in the language that's being used to describe something, right? So we might say something like, the brain processes information. We don't have to say the brain processes information like a computer. No. What else processes information? So the analogy is already implicit, embedded in the language itself. So a lot of language is formed that way. How is analogy mostly used to aid understanding? Sorry, I've got a coffee pot bubbling away in the background. How is analogy mostly used to aid understanding? Well, you can look at the creative process. You could do some research and find out about the creative thinking process. There are thinkers behind it. There is research behind it. Brainstorming isn't just something that we call it. It is something that has been researched and developed in the context of lateral thinking studies. It's a feature of divergent thinking. There's another search term with an aim to solve or promote creative comparisons between different elements for a variety of reasons, and you could look at what are those reasons. In the arts, analogy serves more roles than simply aiding an understanding. Is that a pathway worth going down? You've got aesthetic roles of analogy, and you've got social critique of analogy as well. So these are greater purposes and greater roles than simply aiding our understanding of something, which would be possibly more defensible in the context of the sciences. The benefits and limitations of analogy, so you can break it up like this, and we could say in the sciences, analogy provides a starting point for further experimental inquiry to proceed from, or it's to provide, and it may be used to provide or control for different variables which might be otherwise unknown. We can't see those variables right away, directly. So once we think laterally and we think, okay, maybe the phenomenon under study or the process under study is like something else. It's analogous to something else because they have these shared features. Now that we know that it's like something else, that might promote us down different lines of inquiry. Okay, how else does analogy benefit understanding? Not sure what I mean by that, or what I meant by that. How does analogy aid understanding in the arts? Understanding about what? Right? What are we trying to understand when we say that something is understood in the arts? Well, something interesting could be to consider the performance arts, where analogy is often symbolic, or directly from the scripts, directly from the writing, where it's used directly in words. Your beauty is like the rising sun. That's an analogy. What does that help us to understand? Well, on one level, there at the literary level, at the story level, at the level of the story, it's helping us to understand the love that one character feels towards another character, or at least his desire. However, it might be more interesting to consider understanding in the arts, to look at artworks that are actually provocative for social reflection and social self-analysis, where the arts are conveying a message to society to understand or appreciate a situation. That might be interesting too. Limitations, however, analogy lacks precision, right? There's where it falls down. So the brain is not actually, it's like a computer, yeah, it does share some qualities with computers, but it's not a computer. And there's a lot of other things that the human brain does that a computer cannot do at all. And it can also lead to false conclusions, right? So this is a problem of thinking that analogy is conclusive, right? Because it can lead us to false conclusions. And there's an interesting little kind of a playful example. You couldn't take this example too seriously in the essay, but certainly you could mention it, of the blind man and the elephant. Perhaps you could revise that story a little bit somehow, be creative with the story. Not sure. Be careful about doing that too. Most TOK examiners will understand about the blind man and elephant example, and it'll set you up for a better example. Right? How to ensure that the potential impact of this limitation is mitigated. There you go. That's really where you want to head towards. That knowing that it lacks precision, well, what does that imply? What should scientists or whoever is, that'll be science, right? That it's precision. Maybe in the arts, are the arts also looking for precision? Yes, but possibly for different reasons. So precision in the arts is going to be, you can write about it in a certain way, and or the benefits of precision in the arts and what precision in the arts does and what it looks like, and you can come up with some interesting examples. Precision in the sciences means something else, though, because it has direct impact on technology developments and on real world solutions, and real world understandings that could have more significant impact. Right, so how to ensure that this limitation is compensated for? How is it reduced? And that's when scientists are going to be doing methodology, right? The science of their method. They're going to be looking at the method that they've used, in this case the use of analogy, and they're going to be looking at that saying, okay, what is it that is to be understood which is not satisfied by this analogy? So analogy can help us to see something, to understand something, but it can also show us where the limits of the analogy are and where the beginnings of something else might be. And that can also promote understanding. So the analogy doesn't need to contain all understanding, but it can be then used also as a stepping stone to develop new understanding, or to further inquire into our understanding. Right, so how is it used in the arts and sciences? Is there a sense in the arts that a good analogy can boost and further understanding, that the artist can use it more liberally in an ongoing creative process? However, in the sciences, the analogy can be a stimulus for new avenues of inquiry, but should also be contained with a degree, or apprehended with a degree of skepticism, and cannot be afforded the same type of affirmative, potentially creative role as is being shaped by new evidence and new discoveries. Okay, so analogy is often related to what we know through our direct experience already. 200-300 years ago, there was nothing like computer processors. So the analogies to the human brain never reflected any comparison with computer processing. Whereas nowadays, we have a whole range of new technologies, and potentially we're able to consider our human brain as analogous to new kinds of technology, quantum processing, systems-based processing, rather than linear processing or hierarchical processing. Okay, so, again, do some research into it, and there's lots of really interesting stuff around the place. So there's a bit more here on analogies, can evolve with new discoveries and inventions. What I just mentioned. Possibly you could be going for the counters. When should analogy not be used to aid understanding? Is there times when analogy is dangerous? Does it lead us to some certain rational fallacies? What other devices are used to aid understanding? You can pause the video and take a look at some of that, because I'm going to run out of time on this recording. What other key terms are there to aid understanding? Well, whose? Are there differences between personal understanding and shared understanding? Shared understanding might mean to laypersons or ordinary people, to aid their understanding for people without the technical knowledge to have similar levels of understanding. This has implications in sharing climate science, for example. Whose understandings are not only being aided, but also promoted and narrowed down to propaganda of conveying controlled understanding. Media reports use a particular ideological understanding. So they will be delimiting shared understandings around from a particular ideological perspective, which values certain types of analogies over others. And this is when we can go into a linguistic or a language-based analysis. Limitations of analogy, the stereotypes. You can even use maybe very simple sexist examples. Women are like babies, so we call them baby. Women are sweet, so we call them honey. This is all very biased, male-centric, patriarchal, ideological-based view of the world, which uses those analogies, and then those analogies come into our language and bias us in a negative way. Progression in society, or progress in society, also depend on the vehicles by which controlled understandings, like the ones that I've just mentioned, can be challenged. In order to do so, the arts may use analogy to challenge shared understandings. So on the one hand, analogy might be delimiting or biasing or prejudicing our understandings. On the other hand, the arts can then use analogy to break through those understandings. In a similar way, the natural sciences, analogy can affect or can have an effect on entire paradigm shifts. Weird use of the noun effect there in a verb form. Anyway, there's a bit of research there on paradigm shift. You could have a look at that. I'm going to stop this video here and make a part 2 for this title. Thank you.